So we continue with our series on the big five Indigenous issues we're looking at this evening. Let's ask this question. So is the federal government making good on its promises to Indigenous peoples in this country? Let's get the view from three people who are at the forefront of the battle for change in that relationship to assess the government's progress so far. Kevin Hart is the Manitoba Regional Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. Francyne Joe is the President of the Native Women's Association of Canada. And Isadore is the Ontario Regional Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. It's good to see you all. Thanks for coming in to speak with me about this important issue. And let me just open with that very general question that I started with at the top. How's the government doing? The pledge was to renew the relationship with Indigenous people in this country. They're they're more than halfway through their mandate here as we head towards the next election. How are they doing? Francyne, let me start with you.
What I appreciate with this government is that they've been engaging Indigenous women more so than other governments. But it's been a lot of engagement and not enough action for Indigenous women. And I think that's what we need to see in the next 2 years, is more action coming from these sessions that we've been meeting with the government.
Right. Action where?
We need to see more action where it takes place. What are we actually going to do with missing and murdered? How are we going to increase housing for on-reserve and off-reserve? How are women going to be involved in environmental issues? We have so many different issues that impact our lives, both men and women. We all have roles in our Indigenous communities, and we all need to be involved.
Chief Hart, let me turn to you. How much progress has the government made?
Well, there's been some progress, obviously, in this relationship with the federal government. I hold some very critical files at the Assembly of First Nations. As you know, housing, water, infrastructure is probably some of the top three needs in our First Nations across this country. For myself, from the Manitoba region, we need $3.3 billion alone just to address our housing issue that we have. As you know, there's some chronic needs there. There's some third world conditions that we live in today, in this day and age. You know, on the infrastructure side, I have a lot of remote communities also in my region. The province has stepped up to build the East Side Road there. There's been no federal response or commitment to help establish that East Side Road to directly link our First Nations, right, to mainstream society, because we all know with climate change in the environment, my ice roads and the weeks, it turned into a 12-week season. Now we're down to 3-4 weeks to get goods and necessary supplies into the communities. All
right, we're going to drill down on some of these specific issues in the next, and we got a bit of time together, so that's good. Chief Day, let me turn to you. How much progress has the government made? Can it in effect claim to be renewing the relationship with Indigenous people?
I think the sentiment and the efforts of the federal government at this point to explore and engage on the nation-to-nation relationship, I think the stage is beginning to be set. There are some challenges, however. There's the immediate needs in our communities. Our chiefs and our communities are saying, listen, we don't need the front-end commitment and the investments, 3-4 years from now. We need those investments in our communities today. So there's that issue. But then there's a problem right now that I see in terms of us being at the table from the front end of the process, because what's happening is there's targeted investment and engagement, but there's not targeted investment in what the outcomes should be. So First Nations need to be involved in being able to describe what it is we need now, what we need in the intermediate, and what is the transformative change that is needed. So there's a real process challenge here right now that the federal government has got a lot on the table, and they're falling short on a number of things.
Okay, let's go through some of the key areas that the federal government's dealing with and dealing with in terms of these priorities for Indigenous peoples in this country and some of the promises they made. One of the key ones we have before us these days is a broken child welfare system in Indigenous communities. A system where, and I think Canadians need to hear this because I'm not sure how many of them really know that number, and it's important to say it, that it's almost every day in this country, this is the latest statistics, an Indigenous newborn baby is taken from its mother and placed in state care somewhere in this country, almost every day. The numbers of Indigenous children in state care are off the charts compared to non-Indigenous children. So let's start with there. The minister's got to, say she's got a plan that looks at prevention instead of removal as the way to deal with this issue. Is the government on the right track with where it's trying to go with improving child welfare services?
This government has been working against us for far too long. We had the residential schools, we had the 60 scoop, and now we have the millennial scoop. When is it going to stop? So I think that the speeding that we've had recently has shown that this government, Carolyn Bennett and Minister Philpott, has good intentions. But now, how is that going to play out? How are bands, how are Métis groups, how are Inuit groups, how are we going to get involved to protect our children? Because that is our future, right?
Mm-hmm. Chief Hart?
The Manitoba region right now, as you know, you mentioned those stats, 1.5 babies are being apprehended each and every day in our region.
Just in Manitoba?
Just in Manitoba alone. So when we talk about that, we know that Minister Philpott and that have come forward to make some commitments to First Nations, Inuit and Métis people to talk about the reform of CFS and child welfare industry right now. But let's talk about that. We're talking about trying to fix a system that's already broken. We can't fix a system that's already broken.
So what's the ultimate fix?
The alternative is to engage with us, as the leadership has been saying, working with our grandmothers and our mothers, to fix that jurisdiction and that connection and that sacred bond that we have between a mother and a child. The sad part in the reality is some of these mothers don't even know how their babies look because they're apprehended as soon as they're born. And that's the reality that's facing First Nations when it comes to child welfare. And in Manitoba alone, we have 13,000 kids that are in care. Of that, 10,000 are Indigenous children. They're living in homes where 65% of them are learning a language that is not even from our homelands here.
That gives us an even wider sense of the depth of the problem, Chief Day. The government seems to be heading ultimately, and I'm not sure how easy that path is going to be, but it's ultimately heading, and ministers seem to be conceding that the best way to deal with this issue is that Indigenous communities and Indigenous leaders and Indigenous people ought to be in charge of the child welfare system and the management of the funding for it and the decisions made about removal or not removal and where children go when they need to be removed from a family, if ultimately they do need to be removed from a family. That ought to be left to Indigenous people to decide. Are they on the right track, at least, with that as an end goal?
Oh, for sure. I think the federal government realizes there's far too many studies, there's far too many interventions. The 60 scoop, for example, is just one area. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, all Canadians should understand and watch what's going on there, because what you're talking about is you're talking about the funding piece. That's what this is all about. Child welfare in Canada has become an industry. And essentially, what we see is as a huge funding gap that exists in prevention areas and children's mental health and so on and so forth. Right now, there's we see as the federal family, and then you have the foster care system, which is First Nations driven. Our children are a commodity in this country. So we're essentially looking now at, yes, there's a systems change that's needed, but we need to look right at what the constitutional relationship is right now. The federal family shouldn't be taking our kids at the rate of what they are today. So we need to recognize that the provinces and territories need to give up that jurisdiction, and we need to replace that with our Indigenous systems.
How long do you think it takes before you get there?
It's beginning right now. There's work being done, there's laws being developed, and I can tell you, bar none, that when you see a First Nation take control and authority of languages and culture and customary care, you see successful efforts in creating healthy, productive, happy children.
These are some other statistics as we'll move from this topic, but again, important for people to understand. These are from Statistics Canada. Of all the children under 4 years of age in this country, just 8% are Indigenous, and yet 51%, more than half of all the children under foster care in this country are Indigenous children. How do you make that stop?
It's not going to be an easy fix. It's not going to be a quick fix. It took us many years to get into this issue, hundreds of years, 150 years or more. And it's going to take a long time, but it's going to take baby steps to get started, to get us involved. And once we have the resources at the Indigenous level, we can look after our communities, we can look after our children, we can look after our women.
So can you say yet, can the government check this box on child welfare services and say, we haven't got there yet, but this was a key part of renewing the relationship, and did they get credit for moving that ball down the road? Chief Hart?
Well, you see some developments, obviously. If we had the previous government here, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about child welfare, for one. So, like my colleagues are saying here, baby steps. It's going to be a process to reform child welfare, especially in First Nations. We're going to need partners to come and step up to the table, respecting our rights and sovereignty and jurisdiction, and to work, like I say, for us, we work with our grandmothers and our mothers and our women leaders in my region to address that critical situation of reconnecting and bringing our children home.
You know the issues of water in First Nations communities, and the government has been releasing new figures on how it's trying to remove some of these boil water advisories, and it's gone as far as to complicate its own job by going back and looking at some that maybe shouldn't have been on the list and now adding them to the list to say that, look, this is how serious we are about fixing this. We're even adding to our own problems to try and get these boil water advisories removed. How much progress is the government making on that, Chief Day?
Well, I made the note when the Liberals were running for office. I said, listen, let's quit playing the fiscal shell game. Stop promising envelopes of money, because you could shift money. You can divert.
It's hard to follow where it's going.
Right, exactly. So what I said was, let's remove all the boil water advisories within 5 years. Thomas Mulcair at the time said, we'll do it in 8. Justin Trudeau said, we'll do it in 5. It's given us a time frame to work with. So we need to do what we can to keep putting pressure on the federal government, and whatever it is we need to do at the community level. If we say within the Manitoba region, Ontario region, we need to work with our tribal councils and do all the preparatory work. So I think this is a partnership, but the federal government needs to allocate the money sooner than later.
It still maintains, the minister's still saying they're going to do this in 5 years. They're going to do it when they said they would do it. Can they do it?
It's never too late to do the right thing, is it? I think that this government needs to start moving forward, and I don't care if it takes 2 years, I don't care if it takes 5 years, but we need to start allowing our Indigenous people have the same equal rights that other Canadians have.
You've seen, this is one of the files you work on, Chief Hart. Can they hit this target of 5 years?
Well, there's a lot of work ahead. Obviously, it talks about, at the end of the day, money and investment and opportunity, right? We have a lot of boil water advisories in our communities. We have a lot of infrastructure that's aging out as well that has to be taken into account. And we have places that doesn't even have proper sewer and water. And one example would be the Island Lake region where I'm from in Manitoba, where they still have to use outhouses and such, and they have the honey buckets that they have to haul outside and take down. They're still chopping holes in the ice and hauling water up right now. Right now, here, 2018, that's happening in Island Lake in Manitoba region.
Chief Day?
Peter, back in early 2000, in the province of Ontario, there was a crisis here. There were lives lost as a result of E. coli in the water system at Walkerton. Within 1 year, the province of Ontario gave the directive, these water systems need to be fixed within 1 year. They fixed and they upgraded, they built water systems to the tune of 144 municipalities. That was done in 1 year. So if that's the case, then they can certainly do it for First Nations across the country.
Let's talk about the murdered missing Indigenous women and girls inquiry. I'm guessing the government gets marks for pushing forward, promised an inquiry and then delivered on having an inquiry. But where are we now with the inquiry? Is this what Indigenous people wanted? Is this what they expected? Can this thing actually deliver on the expectations of Indigenous communities if it continues going the way it's going?
Right, we've had families across this country demanding that this inquiry move forward. And there were so many expectations when the announcement was released, 16 months ago now. And unfortunately, we haven't moved very far forward on the inquiry. It's been far too much focused on the operations side of the inquiry rather than on the family side of it, on the healing side of it.
And what should the government do about that? I mean, some of you I know have said there needs to be a complete reset. Government should take control of it. What do you think?
I think from the NWAC's perspective, we've spoken to the families. They're concerned that if we do a reset, how long is it going to take to reset this? Who's going to be in place? So they want to see it succeed more than anything else. And I think that this government needs to appoint a leader who's going to have all the resources needed to lead this inquiry into a successful ending.
Chief Hart, is this inquiry working?
Well, first of all, the previous government never made a commitment to have this inquiry, and that when the Liberal government was elected, one of the 5 priorities that the Prime Minister didn't get no at our AFN Assembly was obviously the national inquiry. Since that time, we've heard from families, and again, I can speak from my region. We are one of the most affected regions in this country when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Social media, I have 1 or 2 women that are going missing each and every week in my region. And that's the sad reality of what's happening. And it all comes down to what we're talking about here today when we talk about the top 5. We need investments. Why are our women leaving communities? We don't have proper housing. There's 20 people living in the house taking shifts to sleep, right? On a young girl who's trying to grow up into a young adult, they don't have that privacy or respect. So yeah, they want to move away from the community. We don't have high schools and that. But for the inquiry itself right now and what we see, yes, there's some turmoil that's happened there. I know a lot of people in my region and families that are up in arms saying that why aren't they focusing on the healing of our families right now that have come before the inquiry already and shared their stories. We don't want to see this inquiry fail. Yes, of course not. We've done too much work and too much work as leaders together collectively to try and push to have this inquiry. And what we need to do is, I think there has to be some kind of new direction forward, some kind of new leadership going forward and such. I don't know if you want to call it a pause or a reset. We can't lose the work that we're doing previously right now. We've had an interim report and a bunch of recommendations from inquiries visiting other regions now. Let's take those recommendations that talk about the safety of our women and our girls and start implementing right now.
Without waiting for the whole end of the process.
Yes, and at the same time, let the inquiry finish off the job that it needs to do. But if we want direct action to save it right now, let's start implementing some of those recommendations that we're hearing from families and the survivors and our women.
Chief Day, again, and this is all in the lens of as we move forward in this government's mandate, is this, again, one of those things we promised an inquiry and it's working just the way we hoped it would, and everybody's happy with it. Is this a good thing that we're having this inquiry in the way it's going, or is this a problem for the government?
Yeah, the overarching mandate is failing. Let's face it, there are a lot of problems, but what do we do about it? There's one thing that Canadians may want to look at here, and we're certainly in the know of what works and what doesn't work. Take the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's working right now, and I'll tell you why it's working. Because it was the Indian residential school survivors that said in their Indian residential school settlement, they said, let's not use all the money for the common experience payment to individuals. Let's take some of that and establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it was the survivors that actually made that commitment. They gave their testimony, they did the truth-seeking exercise, but they made recommendations themselves. You look at reconciliation today, it has changed the face of a nation. We now see an opportunity on the 94 calls to action and the work of the commissioners that I believe is going to have a resounding impact, not just for decades, but for centuries. And I might also add, what do we do about it right now? Okay, Kevin suggests that, let's let this thing unfold, let's do what we can. But I also think that there's a function of independence that is needed within the system, that process itself. What if we had a national ombudsperson's office, for the families that aren't satisfied? What if there was an oversight there that is fully independent of the federal government, because the federal government has full control of that process right now?
Right.
It's like the fox in the hen house.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, you did say, is the process worthwhile? Are we going to get, at the end of the day, something that Indigenous people expected and that answers the questions and deals with some of these key issues of not just what happened, but at this point, to Chief Hart's point, how to heal and how to move forward for these families?
Yeah. I think that this inquiry, one of the best things that's come out of it is the education of some of our Canadian colleagues. They didn't understand why missing and murdered women were so important to us, what was taking place. And I think some of the issues that have been identified at these hearings, these are their neighbors, these are their children's mothers, you know, that are being affected here. So they're more engaged with our communities, and they understand that something has to be done to protect not just Indigenous women, but Canadian women.
Okay, let me, we're kind of running out of time here, and it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you all. Let me talk about resource issues and pipeline. That was part of the pledge, was to be more consultative with Indigenous communities about major resource projects. How's the government doing on that?
I'll start. I recently approached our executive. I had the lead at the AFN executive on helping navigate the 4 pieces of legislation that were changed. And we go back to Idle No More, and why Idle No More happened. It was because of the omnibus legislation from the previous Conservative government. It dealt with those 4 pieces of legislation that are on the table today. One of the commitments that the federal government made, this Liberal government, they said, we will work towards a nation-to-nation relationship. We will actually undo legislation that was previously imposed on you by other governments. And we will work in areas to fix that together. Well, one of the things that didn't happen was the co-drafting of the memo to cabinet and the fundamental pieces that we want to be placed into legislation that will come down very shortly. We didn't have that with this government. You see, when it comes to...
What would that have given you?
It would have given us more discretion in terms of those things that are of our interest. So, for example, the national interest, in priority, it's the economy. For us, it's about the land. That's really going to be the main impasse here with this legislation.
And there was lots of talk of veto power, essentially, for Indigenous communities to say, no, it's not happening. We say no. Are you getting that?
No. Well, we've seen a closed door on that. So I have to step back and work with the First Nations in my region, the 133, to say, where do we go now? We need to make sure that we have a voice in that process, and I certainly can't support a national process that is already starting to fall apart.
Chief Hart, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, when we talk about climate change and environment, obviously, you know, First Nations are feeling the full impacts of climate change in the environment, you know, and yet we contribute the least to climate change in the environment. A lot of work needs to be done to address these issues, including the 4 federal reviews and that. Myself, as the co-chair of the Chiefs Committee on the Environment and Climate Change, you know, we've done a lot of work. Internationally, I've been to the UN summits in Marrakesh, Morocco, you know, to talk about oil and gas development, that, and resource development here in Canada. You know, First Nations, you know, they have the rights and the sovereignty and the autonomy to make those decisions for themselves. And they are making those decisions. It's been very vocal that, you know, Indigenous people across the land are very concerned when it comes to the land and the water. You know, we talk about the boil water advisories in First Nations. There's a key example right there. We don't have proper clean drinking water in our communities. And, you know, for myself, I was sent as the international observer for the Assembly of First Nations in Treaty 1-11 to deliver a message in Standing Rock during that time that, you know, we stood with them because we seen resource developers change the route of the pipeline so that instead of it, if there was going to be some kind of leakage or burst, that Bismarck would not be affected by this. And they changed the route so that now the Standing Rock Sioux people would be directly affected, right, and everybody else downstream. So, you know, it goes hand in hand. You know, where's the respect in the relationship when we talk nation to nation?
Francyne Joe, can the government tick that box off? We are more consultative when it comes to resource projects, and we are giving Indigenous people in those communities affected a greater voice.
At this time, I can't check that box. We have grandmothers fighting on the East Coast against fracking. We have women in BC fighting against LNG and Site C Dam. We have young women trying to defend our water. There hasn't been enough consultation for our people in this area.
Okay. Is there anything we haven't talked about that we should have talked about that about what this government promised and where it's delivering or not delivering? Chief Day?
Yes, the one big one for me here is the Bill C-45, the cannabis legislation. This is a promise of the government today, and they will be moving forward this summer with cannabis now being legal in terms of recreational use. Strikingly for us, our concern is going to be this excise tax. You've seen something very important take place when the federal government met with the provinces and territories, and the finance minister laid the plan out. Initially, it was supposed to be a 50% split on the excise tax coming from cannabis proceeds, but the provinces and the municipalities said, well, we need resources at the local level. So it turned out recently in the last month or so, the commitment is 75% to the provinces and 25% to the federal government. First Nations were not involved. This is a major issue, Peter, because this is prohibition being lifted right in cannabis. It's a major societal shift, and there's so much gray area and ambiguity, and there hasn't been any attention afforded to what's going to happen on First Nations when provincial laws need to be enforced in our communities, which are under federal legislation, the Indian Act. There's a lot of unanswered questions, and the federal government has a major issue on its hands, and we're getting to work on that. I am the co-chair of the National Cannabis Task Force with Ghislain Picard from Quebec. We met recently, and we're saying, we got to move fast.
Okay, quick comments from all of you as we end. The government is, we're still, some ways out from the next election, but the groundwork's clearly being laid as governments now, at this point in their mandate, they shift from having been elected and putting promises in the window to deliverables now. That's really the gist of the conversation. Where are they on that path? Are Indigenous people feeling, okay, this is a better relationship than it was when the government took over 2+ years ago?
This government, I felt, could have made some real headway with Indigenous women, but when they voted against S3 last June 21st, it was a fault, and they're now back into engagement sessions again. So I'm going to give this government a passing grade, but they can do more.
Chief Hart?
Well, this present government, obviously, we talk about the present government, our previous government 2 years ago. We wouldn't have the time of day right now to sit with ministers in offices or even have a prime minister engage or even talk about a renewed nation-to-nation relationship.
So that's progress.
That's progress. Okay. And at the same time, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. As you said, we talked about some very critical issues: housing, water, infrastructure. If we're going to reform child welfare, I need houses in my communities. I need proper water. I need infrastructure for roads and bridges and schools and daycares, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Myself too, I commend this government for stepping up and making those commitments and promises to us. Is there a lot of things? There's a lot of gray areas. Yeah, we still have to work that out. But on the relationship part, we have a government that's actually want to sit down and listen. We had a previous government that wouldn't even let us get our foot in the door. So for myself, this government is really working on a nation-to-nation relationship. It's slow, yes. There's a lot of progress that needs to be done. But it goes hand in hand with respecting the rights and the sovereignty of our people and working with us, not just having that top-down approach.
All right. Chief Dave, final word to you.
Yeah, I'm going to say B- for better. It's better than the last government. There are some major issues that are in front of us. The cannabis excise tax is a major issue. A lot of work to do, and I think the efforts have been made. We're positioning ourselves quite well in many of our regions and First Nations across the country. I think we're raising the bar, and I think the government needs to pay attention to that.
Thank you so much for coming in and providing your perspective. I think it's important for all Canadians to hear it as we push through our conversation here about where this government's at, and it's been really useful and informative to hear your points of view. Thank you so much.
Thank you.